He came to court for a business deal, but 4 little girls on a bench changed his life with just 3 words: "We're hungry, sir." Nicholas Evans arrived at the downtown courthouse just before 10 in the morning, expecting to be in and out in less than 20 minutes. It was supposed to be a routine errand, signing and collecting final documents for a merger his company had been working on for months. Dressed in his signature light gray tailored suit, every detail of his appearance was controlled and immaculate. His dark hair was combed back with intention, and his icy blue eyes scanned the lobby without pause. He walked with the calm precision of a man used to having doors open before he even reached them. Time was his currency, and he spent it carefully. He stepped into the familiar marble foyer, where the polished floors reflected the harsh glow of institutional lighting. Lawyers passed by with purpose, security guards stood casually by the metal detectors, and the smell of paper and faint perfume lingered in the air. Nicholas glanced at his watch, planning to be back in the office before lunch. But then, something unusual caught the edge of his vision: a group of 4 little girls, sitting quietly on a wooden bench just outside one of the courtrooms. They couldn't have been older than 6. All of them had blonde hair, braided or loosely tied back, and strikingly bright blue eyes. 2 wore pale yellow dresses, the other 2 wore soft pink. They sat close together, their feet not quite touching the floor, their expressions somber and exhausted. They looked completely out of place in a courthouse full of adults and briefcases. No toys. No parents. No signs of supervision. Just 4 tiny figures huddled together in silence. Nicholas slowed his pace and turned toward them, something instinctual stopping him. He walked up slowly, not wanting to alarm them, and lowered himself to their level. "Are you lost?" he asked gently. One of the girls in a yellow dress looked up at him, her face calm but her eyes tired. She shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "We're waiting." "Waiting for who?" he asked. "Our mom," said another girl. "She's in court." He looked around the hallway. No adult seemed to be paying attention to them. "How long have you been here?" he asked. The girl shrugged. "A while. We're hungry." Those 2 words stopped him cold. He looked at them again, really looked, and noticed how thin they were, how dry their lips were, how their eyes avoided contact the way children did when they'd been taught not to ask for too much. They weren't just sitting quietly, they were surviving. Nicholas stood and scanned the room again. He should have walked away. It wasn't his business. He was a CEO, not a social worker. But something in their quiet presence struck a chord in him that hadn't been touched in years. He turned to the court officer at the nearby desk. "Excuse me," he said. "Do you know who these girls belong to?" The officer looked over, nodded vaguely. "Yeah, their mom's in the courtroom down the hall. Some theft case. They've been there a while." "No one came with them." Nicholas frowned. "They've been here all morning?" The officer shrugged. "Think so. Maybe longer." With no more than that, the officer returned to his paperwork. Nicholas turned back to the girls. "Have you eaten anything today?" he asked. They shook their heads. One of the girls tried to smile but didn't quite make it. Nicholas didn't think. He acted. "Wait here," he said, and walked out of the courthouse without another word. 15 minutes later, he returned with bags of food from the nearest cafe, sandwiches, juice boxes, fruit. He handed the food to the girls, expecting them to devour it, but they didn't. They opened the bags carefully, passed items between themselves, and ate slowly, quietly, with a strange kind of discipline. Not desperation. Just quiet gratitude. He sat down on the bench next to them, still unsure what he was doing or why. He couldn't stop watching them. They didn't beg. They didn't cry. They didn't ask for anything. But somehow, they were saying everything. And in that moment, Nicholas Evans, a man who lived by logic, numbers, and power, felt something crack open inside him. Something small, but irreversible. Nicholas stayed on that wooden bench far longer than he expected. The courthouse hallway, usually just a transition space between obligation and resolution, had become the place where something unfamiliar stirred inside him. He kept glancing at the girls, observing their quiet coordination. They weren't just siblings, they were a unit. One of the girls in pink handed her sandwich to the one in yellow when she noticed hers had less filling. Another wiped the youngest's mouth with a napkin and smoothed her dress without being asked. They had clearly done this, looked after each other, many times before. There was no whining, no fussing, no playfulness. Only patience. And hunger, not just for food, but for safety. As they ate, Nicholas leaned back and studied the courtroom door across from them. The nameplate read, Judge Harper. That's where their mother was. He wondered what kind of woman had raised these girls to be so resilient and so heartbreakingly restrained. He wondered why she had brought them to court at all, why no one else had stepped in, why this situation had been allowed to go so unnoticed by everyone around them. A dozen people had passed them by, and no one had looked twice. One of the girls, the one who had spoken to him first, turned to him again. "Are you a lawyer?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. I'm someone who's here for some papers." She tilted her head. "You wear a fancy watch. Like Mr. Garrett." Nicholas blinked. "Who's Mr. Garrett?" She exchanged a glance with her sister, then looked down. "Mama's boss. He's the one who said she did something bad." The words were simple, but they punched through him with unsettling clarity. He leaned forward a little. "Do you know what he said she did?" "She didn't do it," the girl in pink answered quickly. "Mama said he lied because he was mad. She said he wanted to do bad things, and when she said no, he got mean." Nicholas inhaled slowly. That sentence unraveled more than he was ready for. He knew the type. He had worked with powerful men long enough to recognize how easily someone in control could twist the truth. A man like Garrett, rich, protected, manipulative, could destroy someone like Anna Ray with a single accusation. Especially if she had no resources, no voice, and no one on her side. In that moment, Nicholas realized this wasn't just about kindness or momentary compassion. This was about justice. About seeing something broken and knowing he had the tools to fix it. He felt that old business instinct, the drive to investigate, to uncover, to outmaneuver, but for once, it wasn't about profit. It was about doing what no one else was willing to. A courtroom clerk passed by, and Nicholas stopped him. "The case being held in Judge Harper's room, Anna Ray. Do you have the docket or a summary?" The clerk hesitated. "Are you involved in the case?" "I might be," Nicholas said calmly, flashing the kind of authoritative smile that usually opened doors. "I know her employer. I want to make sure the truth is heard." The clerk, recognizing his name from several high-profile court donations, returned a few minutes later with a printed summary. Nicholas scanned the page, his jaw tightening. Theft of personal property. 1 count. Item, a Patek Philippe watch valued at over $80,000. The employer listed, Garrett D. Brown, senior partner at a mid-tier but well-connected law firm. Nicholas knew that name. Brown had been on the periphery of some questionable dealings in the past but had always stayed just clean enough to avoid fallout. He was the type of man who played golf with judges and thought HR complaints were merely female mood swings. The courtroom doors opened at last, and a small group of people exited. Among them was a thin, pale woman with worn features and a sharp, observant gaze. Her brown hair was pulled into a loose bun, her dress clean but clearly second-hand. She clutched a stack of folders to her chest, and her eyes went straight to the bench. The moment she saw her daughters, her expression changed from exhaustion to urgency. She hurried over. "Girls," she said in a strained voice. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know it would take this long. Did anyone?" "They ate," said the oldest. "He brought food." The woman looked up at Nicholas, confused. "You did?" He stood, offering a small nod. "They said they were hungry. I couldn't just walk away." The woman's mouth tightened, like she wasn't used to accepting kindness. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he said quietly. "But someone should have." She blinked, clearly taken aback by his sincerity. "I'm Anna," she said after a pause. "Anna Ray." "Nicholas Evans," he replied. She froze for a moment, recognizing the name. "The Nicholas Evans?" He gave a modest nod. "It's just a name." "You don't belong in this hallway," she said softly. He glanced at the girls, then back at her. "Maybe today I do." Anna bit her lip, her arms tightening around the folders. Nicholas could see how hard she was trying not to show weakness, how she carried every ounce of fear and pride like armor. But the cracks were visible: fatigue, injustice, hopelessness. She didn't ask for help. She didn't plead. And that moved him more than if she had broken down right in front of him. "I read the summary," he said carefully. "If there's anything I can do. I know lawyers. Good ones." She shook her head quickly. "No, I can't afford." "I didn't ask for payment," he interrupted. "I asked if I could help." There was silence between them. The girls watched, wide-eyed, unsure what this meant. Finally, Anna spoke. "If I say yes, what happens next?" Nicholas glanced again at her daughters, 4 girls who deserved more than a bench and fear and cold silence. He looked back at Anna. "Then we fight," he said. "And this time, you won't be doing it alone." The next morning, Nicholas arrived at his office earlier than usual, but his mind wasn't on mergers or meetings. He had barely slept the night before, too distracted by what he had seen and learned in the courthouse. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured the girls sitting quietly on that bench, too polite to complain, too used to waiting. He kept thinking about Anna, how she had looked at him like she couldn't afford to hope, and how carefully she held herself together in front of her children. Something about her story unsettled him more deeply than he expected. Not just because of the injustice, but because of how easily it could have gone unnoticed. He had walked into that building with every intention of leaving unchanged. Instead, he walked out with a responsibility he hadn't planned for. As soon as his assistant, Grace, stepped into his office, he called her over. "I need you to find everything you can on a man named Garrett D. Brown. He's a senior partner at Kelmore & Bell." Grace, ever efficient and unflappable, gave him a curious glance. "You're not suing him, are you?" "Not yet," he said, dead serious. "But I want to know what kind of man he is before I decide how far I'm going." By mid-afternoon, he had a thick file on his desk. Garrett Brown, as expected, had a spotless public record. Respected in the legal community, no formal complaints on file, multiple charitable donations, and an active member of a high-end golf club. But as Nicholas dug deeper, reading between the lines, looking through employee turnover reports and anonymous online reviews, he began to see the pattern. Several women had quietly left the firm over the years, their exits all abrupt and unexplained. None had ever spoken publicly, but there were whispers. Off-the-record comments on legal forums. Subtle red flags that never made it to HR documentation. Nicholas had seen it before. A man who used power as protection. A man who understood the system well enough to abuse it without leaving fingerprints. He called his legal counsel, but not the ones who handled corporate litigation. Instead, he reached out to an old contact, Michael Sloan, a former prosecutor turned defense attorney, now working primarily in civil rights and wrongful accusations. They hadn't spoken in over a year, but when Nicholas described the situation, Michael agreed to meet with Anna the very next day. When Nicholas called Anna to let her know, she hesitated. Her voice was wary. "I don't want to owe you anything." "You won't," he said firmly. "This isn't charity. It's justice." There was a pause on the line. Then, quietly, she said, "Okay. I'll come." The meeting was arranged in a neutral, private office space Nicholas kept for personal matters. When Anna arrived, she looked overwhelmed but composed. She had borrowed a nicer blouse, and her hair was neater, but the strain was still visible in her face. Her daughters were with a trusted neighbor for a few hours, something she rarely allowed, but she knew this meeting mattered. Michael greeted her with quiet respect, not condescension. He listened carefully as Anna explained everything. She told him about the weeks leading up to the accusation, how Garrett had started lingering too long after hours, how his compliments turned into invitations, how she had rejected him politely but clearly. And then, how the mood shifted. How he suddenly claimed his luxury watch was missing and reported her without warning. Michael took notes but also listened like a human being. When she finished, she looked down and said, "There's no proof. It's just my word." Nicholas, who had remained silent until then, spoke up. "There's more than your word. There's a pattern. And I don't think you're the first." Anna looked up, startled. "You found others?" "Possibly. Nothing confirmed yet, but we're working on it." Michael nodded. "This is more common than people realize. Men like Garrett make sure they appear untouchable. But once one thread unravels, the whole thing can fall apart. I'm going to help you file a countersuit for false accusation and workplace harassment." Anna shook her head in disbelief. "How will I ever afford that?" Nicholas leaned forward. "You won't." "I will." "But, why?" she asked, truly struggling to understand. "You don't even know me." Nicholas hesitated, then said something he hadn't told anyone else. "Because once, a long time ago, someone helped my mother when no one else would. I watched what it did to her when no one believed her. And I promised myself, if I ever had the power to stop that from happening to someone else, I'd use it. No matter what it cost." Anna didn't respond right away. But something shifted in her. A small flicker of trust. Not full belief, she'd been hurt too much for that, but something new. A fragile beginning. As they left the office, Nicholas walked her to the door. "Whatever happens next," he said, "you're not alone anymore." She nodded, clutching the folder Michael had given her. And for the first time since they met, she didn't look like she was preparing for the worst. She looked like someone starting to believe the worst might not come. The legal proceedings began quietly, but tension simmered beneath the surface like a storm building on the horizon. Anna's countersuit had been officially filed, and though the initial paperwork didn't shake the ground, it was enough to make Garrett Brown take notice. Nicholas knew it wouldn't take long for Garrett to retaliate. Men like him didn't let accusations slide without attempting to discredit or intimidate. True to form, just 2 days after the filing, anonymous reports surfaced online questioning Anna's credibility. Someone leaked her employment record, exaggerated disciplinary notes, and even implied she had been involved in other thefts, though there was no proof to back any of it. Nicholas recognized the tactic immediately. Garrett was leveraging his connections, using subtle character assassination to poison the narrative before it reached court. Nicholas wasn't surprised, but Anna was devastated. When she arrived at his office late that afternoon, her hands trembled as she clutched her phone. She had read the online posts, seen the cruel comments. Her voice was low and flat when she said, "They're calling me a liar. A thief. Some of the moms at school already stopped talking to me." She couldn't meet his eyes. What if this hurts the girls? What if I just made it worse for them? Nicholas walked around the desk and gently guided her to sit. "You didn't make this worse." "He did. You stood up for yourself. That takes more courage than most people can imagine. Anna shook her head. I just want to disappear. You don't get to disappear, he said firmly, but not unkindly. You have 4 daughters who need you to keep standing. Anna's eyes welled up. She looked like she hadn't slept. Like hope itself had become too heavy to carry. I didn't want to fight, she whispered. I just wanted to keep my job and protect my kids. Nicholas sat beside her, keeping his tone steady. I know. But now it's not just about you. He's done this before, and if no one stops him, he'll do it again. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're setting fire to something that needs to burn down. The words seemed to settle her. She inhaled slowly, wiped her eyes, and finally nodded. Then I guess we keep going. Meanwhile, Michael Sloan intensified the investigation. With Nicholas funding every step, he was able to hire 2 private researchers, discreet professionals with backgrounds in legal compliance and forensic HR analysis. Within days, they found a former paralegal who had left Garrett's firm 5 years earlier after a sudden and unexplained departure. Her name was Lauren Chase. She had signed a non-disclosure agreement, but once she heard Anna's story and learned that others were now coming forward, she agreed to meet. Nicholas, Anna, Michael, and Lauren met in a small, neutral office off-site. Lauren was nervous, constantly wringing her hands, but she eventually opened up. Garrett had followed a pattern, offering mentorship, growing increasingly familiar, then turning aggressive. When she rebuffed him, her annual review mysteriously tanked. She was accused of failing to handle confidential documents, then quietly pushed out of the firm. HR had buried it with a generous severance and a warning that if she spoke, she'd be sued. Michael asked, "Do you still have any written communication from him?" Lauren hesitated, then reached into her bag. "I erased a lot of it, but I printed the worst one before I left. I couldn't let myself forget what really happened." She handed over a folded piece of paper. Nicholas read it in silence, his jaw tightening as the words spelled out the disgusting familiarity of power misused. It was crude, manipulative, and clear. There would be no mistaking Garrett's intent. With this document, the case took on new weight. Now it wasn't just Anna's word against Garrett's reputation, it was a pattern of abuse. Michael amended the countersuit to include sexual harassment and retaliation. A media strategy was prepared, carefully worded and grounded in fact, so that if Garrett tried to leak more attacks, they'd be ready with the truth. Nicholas made the strategic decision to go public, not with Anna's full identity, to protect the children, but with a statement of support from his own name. The press release was subtle but direct. A prominent CEO standing behind a woman wrongfully accused of theft by a man he described as habitually predatory and unfit to hold power. The story caught fire online. Whispers became conversations. Garrett's firm released a statement distancing themselves from him, placing him on immediate leave. The board had no choice but to initiate an internal review. Anna watched it unfold from the safety of Nicholas's guest house, where she and her daughters had been staying temporarily. It was the first time in weeks that she had felt safe enough to breathe. She stood in the kitchen, watching her girls draw spaceships and unicorns on the marble counter with dry erase markers Nicholas had given them, and she finally allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. Later that evening, Nicholas found her in the garden, wrapped in a sweater, staring at the sky. She turned to him as he approached. "I didn't think anyone would ever believe me," she said. "Sometimes people need to see a spark before they realize what's burning," he replied. She looked at him with something different now, not gratitude, not disbelief, but recognition. "I don't know what you were before this, but whatever it was, this suits you better." Nicholas didn't reply right away. He thought about all the years he'd spent chasing control, shutting out emotion, avoiding mess. And now here he was, entangled in a life he hadn't seen coming, but one that suddenly felt more real than anything before. "I think I agree with you," he said. In the distance, the sound of the girls' laughter echoed through the house. And for the first time in a very long time, Nicholas Evans didn't feel like he was losing anything by standing still. He felt like he was finally starting to win something that mattered. The court date came faster than anyone expected, accelerated not by luck but by pressure, legal, public, and personal. Garrett Brown, who had been so confident in his ability to control the narrative, was now at the center of an unfolding scandal. The media had caught hold of the case's outline, not the salacious headlines Garrett feared, but the more dangerous kind, facts. Verified statements. Witness accounts. Documents. The court couldn't ignore it anymore. And Nicholas, who had once thought his role would end with hiring the right lawyer, found himself more involved than ever, not just as a supporter, but as a visible presence, a symbol that someone with influence was finally using it for someone else. On the morning of the hearing, Anna dressed carefully. Her hands trembled slightly as she buttoned the cuffs of a soft blue blouse that Nicholas's assistant had picked out for her, and which Anna insisted on paying for even if Nicholas refused the money. It wasn't vanity, it was pride. She didn't want to walk into that courtroom looking like a victim. She wanted to look like a woman who had survived everything meant to break her. Her daughters, too young to attend the hearing, stayed home under the care of Maria, the retired schoolteacher who now helped part-time with the girls. As Anna prepared to leave, her oldest daughter, Emma, hugged her tightly and whispered, "Be brave, like you always tell us." Michael Sloan met Anna at the courthouse steps. He was calm, collected, confident. A lawyer who didn't believe in intimidation but who knew how to devastate with the truth. Nicholas arrived shortly after, his presence commanding as always, but different now. There was warmth in his posture, not calculation. When Anna saw him, her expression softened, and she exhaled in a way that told him she had been holding her breath the whole morning. Inside, the courtroom was quiet but charged. On one side sat Anna, composed but visibly tense. On the other side, Garrett, with his new legal team, one that looked expensive but hurriedly assembled. He had the expression of a man unaccustomed to consequences. For so long, he'd spoken without fear, acted without resistance, and now, every tick of the clock seemed to unsettle him. The judge began by reviewing the amended countersuit. Michael spoke clearly, outlining the timeline of harassment and retaliation, supported by Lauren Chase's statement and the now widely publicized email Garrett had written years ago. When Garrett's lawyers attempted to undermine Anna's credibility, Nicholas stood and asked to be heard, not as a witness but as a character reference. The judge allowed it. Nicholas stepped forward, straightening his cuffs out of habit. His voice was calm but firm. "I've spent most of my life building systems that reward power," he began. "And I've come to learn that those same systems can protect the wrong people if no one speaks up." Anna Ray was nearly destroyed by one of those systems, not because she did something wrong, but because she refused to let someone exploit her. She is brave, resilient, and honest. I have no financial stake in this case. I'm not here because of a contract or a partnership. I'm here because the truth matters. And the only way this courtroom holds value is if it listens to voices that are usually ignored. There was silence when he finished, not out of awkwardness, but respect. Even the judge looked affected. Garrett's team declined to cross-examine. They had nothing to stand on. The weight of the truth had begun to crush the fiction Garrett had carefully built for years. The ruling wasn't immediate, but it didn't need to be. Everyone in that courtroom felt the shift. Anna had been heard. Fully. Publicly. Powerfully. And Garrett, though not yet convicted of anything criminal, was no longer protected by silence. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Anna, holding the legal summary in her hands, looked overwhelmed. Nicholas gently touched her shoulder and asked if she was okay. She nodded, barely able to speak. "I didn't think I'd make it through that." "You didn't just make it through," he said quietly. "You stood taller than anyone else in that room." They didn't give interviews. There was nothing to sell. No spin to craft. Instead, Nicholas guided her to the car, and they drove home without speaking much. But silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like understanding. That evening, Anna told her daughters everything, not the legal details, but the truth they needed to hear. That she had stood up to someone unfair. That she didn't give up. That she had people beside her who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. The girls listened intently. Then the youngest one asked, "Does that mean he's gone forever?" Anna hesitated, then looked to Nicholas, who had been standing in the doorway, listening. He stepped into the room. "He won't be hurting anyone else," he said. "Not anymore." The girls nodded, satisfied in that childlike way that still believed in good people winning. And for the first time in weeks, the house felt whole again, not just safe, but alive with something new. Later that night, Anna stepped outside onto the porch, where Nicholas stood with a cup of tea, staring up at the stars. She joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Do you know what today felt like?" she asked. He looked at her. "What?" "Like the beginning of something I didn't think I'd ever get back. A voice. A future." He nodded. "Then let's build on it." And they stood together in the cool evening air, side by side, not needing to speak further. The worst had passed. The truth had been seen. And tomorrow no longer looked so far away. In the weeks following the court hearing, Anna's life began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways, subtle at first, but unmistakably forward. The immediate threat was gone. Garrett Brown had been formally suspended from his firm pending further investigation, and with the civil case underway and the media keeping attention on the matter, the legal community began to quietly distance themselves from him. What was once whispered became openly acknowledged, and for the first time in her life, Anna was not the one being watched, but the one being supported. Yet even as things improved, healing was not instant. There were moments when she still woke in the night, startled by dreams of being chased down hallways or losing her children. She often found herself holding her breath in elevators, as though waiting for something to collapse. But now, for the first time, she had people in her corner who stayed when the pressure built. And among them, no one stood more firmly than Nicholas. Their relationship had developed quietly, organically, with no clear line between gratitude and something deeper. He never forced conversation, never overstepped, but he was always there, in the form of a warm meal after a long day, a gentle word when her nerves threatened to crack, or a moment of silent presence on the back porch when she simply didn't want to be alone. It was a companionship built on trust that neither of them rushed to define. Nicholas, for his part, found himself more grounded than he'd ever felt in his life. In the corporate world, he'd been a strategist, always 10 steps ahead, building empires on paper and behind boardroom doors. But none of it had ever felt like this, like walking into Anna's kitchen and helping a 6-year-old pour cereal without spilling, or listening to the girls argue over which movie to watch, or hearing the sound of real laughter after a meal that wasn't rushed or polished. He started spending more time away from his office, not out of avoidance, but because he no longer felt chained to it. He delegated more, trusted his team more, and for the first time, gave his assistant permission to cancel meetings when his heart wasn't in them. Grace, who had worked with him for nearly a decade, commented dryly one day, "I don't know who that woman is, but please thank her for returning your soul." Anna didn't know about that conversation, but she felt the change too. Her daughters adored him. They waited by the window when he was due to arrive, ran to him with drawings and questions, and treated him with the kind of ease they had only shown with each other. One day, her daughter Lily, the shyest of the four, tugged on her sleeve and whispered, "Is he going to stay with us forever?" The question was both innocent and impossibly complicated. Anna had no answer at the time. She simply kissed Lily's forehead and said, "Let's see what tomorrow brings." Nicholas wasn't just watching from the sidelines, he was actively helping her rebuild. He introduced her to a friend who ran a reputable law firm focused on family and labor cases. After just one interview, Anna was offered a job, not as a cleaner, but as a legal assistant. Her organizational skills, her first-hand understanding of injustice, and her quiet determination made her a natural fit. She started shadowing paralegals, learning the basics of case documentation and client coordination. For the first time, she saw the legal world not as a weapon used against her but as a tool she could learn to use for others. At night, she studied after the girls went to bed, scribbling notes on notepads and legal texts, sometimes falling asleep at the kitchen table. Nicholas would find her there, cover her with a blanket, and gently turn off the lamp. He never said much in those moments, never treated her like a project or someone to be fixed. He simply remained close. The kind of close that meant safety, not pressure. Their bond deepened in quiet ways. There was no grand confession, no dramatic moment. But one afternoon, as they were watching the girls play in the backyard, Anna turned to him and asked, "How did you end up being the one who showed up when no one else did?" Nicholas looked at her for a long moment, then answered, "Maybe I was meant to. Maybe everything else in my life was leading here, even when I didn't know it." She didn't say anything else, but she reached out and took his hand. And they stayed like that, together, not because of obligation or rescue, but because of choice. He wasn't trying to save her. She didn't need saving anymore. What they were building now was something neither of them had planned for. And yet, it felt exactly right. As summer approached, the house felt lighter. The girls thrived in school. Anna started training for a certification course that would eventually allow her to manage legal cases on her own, and Nicholas found joy in things that once seemed trivial. He cooked badly and proudly, burning toast and misjudging pasta portions, and the girls teased him for it relentlessly. They built routines around one another, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. There was a peace in the simplicity, a sense that for all the hardship they had endured, life was finally offering them something they hadn't dared hope for, a quiet, lasting kind of happiness. And it was in that quiet that something new began to bloom, not just healing, but the slow, sure promise of a future they would build together. As autumn arrived, the air grew cooler, but the warmth inside Anna's new life only deepened. She had found her rhythm, not just as a mother, but as a woman reclaiming her voice. Her mornings began early, preparing the girls for school, packing lunches, tying shoes, brushing tiny braids, and exchanging sleepy smiles over cereal bowls. Then she would ride the bus to the legal office where she was now working part-time while finishing her certification course. Her days were busy, challenging, and full of unfamiliar responsibilities, but they were hers. She no longer felt like she was surviving someone else's decisions. She was choosing, building, becoming. At the office, Anna's supervisors praised her reliability, her intuition, and her empathy. Clients trusted her because she spoke from a place of understanding, and her coworkers admired the quiet determination that carried her through every task. She didn't boast, didn't draw attention, but she became someone the others relied on. There were days she still battled doubt, moments where fear crept in, whispering that all this could be taken from her again. But now, when those moments came, she remembered Nicholas's steady presence and the girls' laughter echoing through the halls of the home they now shared. Nicholas, too, was changing in ways even he hadn't expected. He no longer carried the weight of his success with pride alone. His work remained important, but no longer all-consuming. He began investing differently, not just in business ventures but in people. Inspired by Anna's resilience, he started a small foundation that offered legal support and emergency housing for single parents facing wrongful accusations. What had started as a personal intervention was becoming a movement. He was still Nicholas Evans, the CEO, the strategist, the man with sharp suits and sharper instincts, but now he was also someone who knelt on the kitchen floor to help a child tie a shoe. Someone who remembered birthdays, who read bedtime stories, who learned how to make pancakes without burning them. Their relationship was no longer undefined. Though neither of them rushed to label it, everything about the way they moved around each other spoke of connection. There was a shared rhythm in their routines, a gentleness in their gestures. Nicholas never tried to replace what Anna had lost. He never called himself the girl's father, never assumed a role without invitation. But the girls didn't wait for titles. They had made their own decision about him long ago. One evening, while Anna worked late, Nicholas sat with them in the living room, helping with homework. Lily, the quietest, suddenly looked up and asked, "Will you be here when I grow up too?" He didn't answer right away. He put down the pencil, looked her in the eye, and said, "If you'll have me, yes." The next morning, Anna found a drawing on the refrigerator. It showed 6 figures holding hands, 4 little girls, a woman with long brown hair, and a tall man with a crooked smile. Above it, in bright crayon, the word family. Anna stared at it for a long time. She didn't cry, though her chest ached with something close to joy. Later that day, she pulled Nicholas aside, took his hand, and said, "They've already decided you're part of us." He smiled, his voice low. "Then I'm home." The seasons continued to turn. The court case was officially closed in Anna's favor. Garrett Brown settled quietly, his reputation beyond repair. Anna never once gloated. She refused interviews, declined attention. All she wanted was peace. And now, at last, she had it. Nicholas invited her to a formal dinner hosted by one of his oldest colleagues. She hesitated at first, unsure of whether she belonged in a room filled with polished executives and curated conversations, but eventually agreed. When the night came, she wore a simple dark green dress, and when she entered the ballroom on Nicholas's arm, no one saw a former cleaning woman or a victim of scandal. They saw a woman with quiet strength and poise, someone who held herself with dignity because she had earned every inch of it. At that dinner, Nicholas introduced her not as a guest, not as someone he was helping, but as his partner. And when she smiled at him across the table, surrounded by men and women who had once lived in an entirely different world, she no longer felt like she was standing outside looking in. She had built something new. With him. With the girls. With herself. And though they didn't say it out loud, both Nicholas and Anna knew, this wasn't a temporary arrangement, or a rescue story. This was a beginning. One neither of them had planned, but one they were now writing together, page by page, with hands that had once only known how to hold on, now learning how to hold each other. Spring arrived gently that year, not with sudden blooms or dramatic weather, but with small, hopeful signs that whispered change rather than shouted it. The trees in the backyard of Nicholas and Anna's home filled with fresh green leaves. The girls ran barefoot through the soft grass, collecting dandelions and creating games with rules only they understood. Their laughter became the background music of every evening, and it echoed through the windows, winding itself around the walls like a spell, one that meant safety, peace, and belonging. Anna's certification exam came and went. She passed with one of the highest scores in her group, something she hadn't expected but Nicholas had never doubted. On the day the results arrived, she held the letter in her hands without opening it for nearly an hour, afraid that even now, something might go wrong. When she finally unfolded the paper and saw the words, "Congratulations," she didn't cry or shout, she simply smiled and looked up at the ceiling, whispering a quiet "thank you" to whatever force had carried her this far. Nicholas found her that afternoon in the garden, standing barefoot on the stone path. He didn't ask what the letter said. He only looked at her face and knew. She nodded once, slowly, and he opened his arms. She walked into them, resting her head against his chest, and for several minutes, they stood in silence, two people who had walked through fire separately and somehow emerged together on the other side. They didn't need a big moment to define what they were anymore. Love had already woven itself into their days. It was in the way Anna always saved the last piece of fruit for him without mentioning it, and the way Nicholas remembered exactly how the girls liked their sandwiches cut. It was in the way they didn't interrupt each other's silences, in how they trusted one another with the truth, no matter how small or difficult. And it was in the way they made space for each other, not just physically, but emotionally. They didn't fill in each other's gaps. They let those gaps breathe, respected them, and walked forward anyway. When Nicholas asked Anna to marry him, it wasn't on one knee or under a sunset. It was over coffee, early one morning, when the house was still quiet and the girls were asleep. He passed her a small envelope across the table. Inside was a hand-drawn card made by the girls, with stick figures holding hands and the words, "Can we keep him forever?" written in pink crayon. Anna laughed softly, holding the card in both hands. Then Nicholas said, "I'd like to be part of this family, officially. If you'll have me." She looked at him for a long time, then whispered, "You already are." But she said yes anyway, because some moments deserve to be spoken aloud, no matter how obvious they feel. The wedding was small. Just close friends, the girls, Michael Sloane, Grace, and a few people from Anna's new job. It was held in their backyard beneath a white tent strung with soft lights. Anna wore a simple ivory dress that floated when she walked, and Nicholas wore a suit without a tie, his concession to the relaxed beauty of the day. The girls walked ahead of them, scattering flower petals with both joy and seriousness, as if they understood they were walking into something sacred. When the vows were spoken, Nicholas didn't promise to protect Anna. He promised to stand beside her. To listen. To grow. To never ask her to be smaller than she was. And Anna didn't promise to follow him. She promised to challenge him, to support him, and to never forget what they had both survived to find each other. After the ceremony, while the sun dipped low in the sky and the air was warm with spring, the girls took turns dancing with Nicholas, their laughter filling the yard. Emma wrapped her arms around his waist and looked up at him with a proud smile. "I knew you'd stay," she said. "I couldn't leave, even if I wanted to," he replied. "You've got me forever." Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the lights had been turned off, Anna and Nicholas sat on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the stars. They didn't speak much. There was nothing more to explain. Everything they had been through, the courtroom battles, the fear, the uncertainty, the rebuilding, it all led here. Not to a perfect life, but to a true one. They hadn't erased their scars. They had grown around them. In the quiet hum of their shared future, they sat hand in hand, knowing the world might still be unpredictable, but that they had become the kind of people who didn't fear uncertainty anymore. They faced it together now. Side by side. And in that stillness, filled with the gentle breathing of a house finally at rest, Nicholas Evans and Anna Ray didn't just feel happy. They felt whole. In my view, the ending of this story isn't just satisfying, it's quietly profound. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or fairy tale perfection, but instead offers something much more rare, emotional honesty and earned peace. What makes it powerful is how real the transformation feels. This isn't about a millionaire saving a struggling mother, or a woman being rescued. It's about two people, scarred in different ways, choosing each other not out of need, but out of mutual respect, healing, and growth. Nicholas doesn't fall in love with the idea of being a hero, he falls in love with reality, with responsibility, with children who look to him not for money but for presence, with a woman who never asked to be saved, only heard. Anna's arc is even more meaningful. She goes from being voiceless and discarded by a system to someone who reclaims her identity, not by fighting louder, but by standing stronger. The ending doesn't suggest that life is suddenly easy, only that it's finally shared. And that's what makes it beautiful. Because the deepest kind of happy ending isn't when everything's perfect, it's when two people find home in each other after learning how to survive the storms on their own. This isn't a love story with a rescue, it's a partnership that grew out of resilience. And those kinds of endings? They last. He walked into his office expecting another routine morning, but found a little girl crying on the floor who whispered, "You're my dad." Oliver Hart arrived at the Carlyle Group headquarters just after 8, as he always did. The early morning sun reflected off the glass facade of the downtown Los Angeles building, casting sharp shadows across the sleek pavement. Inside, everything was as it should be: polished marble floors, glass walls, and employees moving with quiet urgency. As the CEO and founder, Oliver had built his company from nothing, driven by a relentless focus, discipline, and an obsession with control. Dressed in a light beige tailored suit that matched his composed demeanor, he walked through the lobby with his usual commanding presence. His brown eyes were sharp, and his expression unreadable. He was a man who had learned early in life that emotions were best left behind if you wanted to survive. To the outside world, Oliver was the perfect picture of success: a self-made millionaire, a business visionary, a man who had overcome a childhood of poverty to stand at the top. But few knew the truth, that behind the cold confidence, there was a void, something incomplete he rarely allowed himself to think about. He had no wife, no children, no one waiting for him at home. Every part of his identity had become wrapped around the company and its endless demands. He stepped into the main lobby, nodding at the receptionist without slowing down. But as he turned toward the elevator bank, something unusual caught his attention. A small figure was sitting near the far glass wall, in the corner where the floor-to-ceiling windows met the marble. It was a child. A little girl. She looked out of place, completely still, head bowed, her tiny shoulders trembling as she tried to stifle quiet sobs. Oliver froze for a moment. It wasn't a place where children ever came, especially not alone. The entire building was designed for business, meetings, and structure. Children didn't belong here. He looked around, expecting to see a parent rushing up, an explanation waiting nearby. But no one came. The girl was alone. He approached slowly, unsure what to say or do. She didn't react at first. As he got closer, he could see that she was no older than 5, maybe 6. Her dark brown hair was pulled into uneven braids, and her red dress was slightly torn at the hem. Her face was blotchy from crying, but her posture was strangely composed, as if she was used to hiding her emotions in public places. He knelt down in front of her, careful not to frighten her. "Hey," he said gently, softening his voice in a way he hadn't had to in years. "Where are your parents?" The girl looked up at him with wide, glassy blue eyes, so bright and clear they almost startled him. There was something haunting in the way she studied his face, something calm but far too mature for her age. She wasn't afraid of him. In fact, she looked like she had been waiting. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "You're my dad." Oliver blinked. For a second, he wasn't sure he heard her correctly. The world around him seemed to stop. His mind raced, searching for logic, but there was none to be found. He stared at her, stunned into silence. "What did you say?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "My mom told me your name is Oliver Hart," she replied. "She said you're my dad. But she's not here anymore." There was no trace of hesitation in her voice, only a heavy truth, delivered with the painful honesty only a child could manage. Oliver looked into her eyes again, and something deep inside him shifted, something old, something buried, something that refused to be ignored. Oliver stood frozen, still crouched in front of the little girl, the weight of her words settling over him like a thick fog. His mind was trying to process what she had just said, but it couldn't move fast enough to keep up with the reality of it. This child, tiny, tear-streaked, alone, had just called him her father. She didn't stammer. She didn't seem confused. She simply said it, as if she had rehearsed it 1,000 times. And maybe she had. He looked at her again, more carefully now. Her features were delicate, her skin pale, but there was something familiar in the shape of her mouth, the line of her brow. Those blue eyes weren't his were a deep, steady brown, but the longer he looked, the more he saw something of himself, something quiet and buried. It unsettled him. He stood up slowly, glancing around the lobby once more. Still no one. Just the hum of morning routine far on the other side of the building. He turned back to the girl. "What's your name?" he asked. "Haley," she said, without hesitation. "Haley, what's your mom's name?" She hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "Emily. Emily Reed." The name hit him like a strike to the chest. He hadn't heard it in years, but it lived somewhere in his memory like a locked box he'd never opened. Emily. His first real love. They had met in college, shared dorm nights, long walks, dreams about the future. She was the only woman who ever made him feel seen. But he had left for an overseas opportunity before graduation, and everything had unraveled. They tried to stay in touch, but distance, ambition, and the grinding wheel of success pulled him away. Somewhere along the line, the connection faded. He had always wondered what became of her, but never reached out. He was too focused on building his empire, chasing something he wasn't even sure he wanted. And now, standing in the middle of his empire, he was facing the result of his silence. "How did you get here?" he asked quietly. Haley looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "I took a bus. Then I walked. I knew the building from the picture." "What picture?" She reached into the small backpack beside her and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was creased and soft at the edges, as if she had held it often. Oliver unfolded it carefully. It was a printed-out photo from a business article, him, standing in front of the Carlyle Group building, arms crossed, wearing the same kind of suit he wore today. It was from a few years ago, but his name was clearly written beneath the image. Oliver Hart, CEO. "My mom showed me," she said. "She said if something ever happened, I should come find you." Oliver had no words. There was a painful tightness growing in his chest, something unfamiliar. Guilt. Grief. Shock. The words, "if something ever happened," echoed in his head like an alarm bell. "Where's your mom now, Haley?" he asked, even though part of him already knew. "She died," she said simply. "A few weeks ago." The words were like ice. He sat down beside her without realizing it, right there on the cold marble floor. He rubbed a hand across his face, trying to breathe, trying to think. His mind jumped from question to question, but nothing felt real. "Who have you been staying with?" "My aunt. But she said she couldn't take care of me. She moved away. I didn't want to go to a foster home." "So, you came here. Alone?" Haley nodded. He stared at her, stunned by the quiet strength in her voice. She was only 5. She had lost her mother. Been rejected by the last adult she knew. And somehow, she had found her way across the city with a photo in her backpack and a name in her heart. His name. There was no playbook for this. No spreadsheet. No corporate protocol. Just a child who might be his daughter, looking at him with a kind of guarded hope that made his chest hurt. For the first time in years, Oliver felt completely unprepared. But he also knew, deep in his bones, that walking away wasn't an option. He stood up and offered her his hand. "Let's go upstairs," he said quietly. "We'll figure this out together." She reached for him without hesitation. Her small fingers wrapped around his, and that one simple touch cracked something open in him that he hadn't even realized was closed. Oliver led Haley through the private elevator that opened directly to his executive floor. As the doors closed behind them, the silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. Haley held his hand tightly, her grip small but sure. He glanced down at her several times during the short ride, unsure of what to say, how to act, or even what to feel. She had dropped a truth on him so enormous that his mind still hadn't caught up with it. The fact that she was standing beside him now, real, alive, and apparently his child, felt like something out of a dream. Or a memory rewritten by fate. When they entered his office, she didn't hesitate. She walked slowly across the vast space, looking around as if trying to understand the world her mother had once spoken about. Oliver's office was a reflection of his life, immaculate, cold, minimalistic. It had towering glass windows with panoramic views of the city, a massive desk of dark wood, and shelves lined with awards, not family photos. There had never been space in this room for softness. Until now. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked, already moving toward the side cabinet where he kept bottled water and a few dry snacks. "Or maybe something to drink?" Haley shook her head. "No, thank you." Her politeness stung more than it should have. He wasn't used to children, but somehow he could tell she'd been taught, or forced, to grow up quickly. That realization gnawed at him. This wasn't just about her being his daughter. This was about a little girl who had clearly been through too much already. He sat down across from her at the small conference table. She sat quietly, her backpack beside her, her small legs swinging slightly from the oversized chair. "I need to ask you some things," he said gently. "Is that okay?" Haley nodded once, calm as ever. "Do you know for sure that I'm your father? Did your mom tell you anything else? Show you anything?" Haley reached into her bag again. This time, she pulled out a plastic envelope. Inside were folded documents, photographs, and a worn, faded letter. She handed them to him with both hands. "My mom said if I ever found you, I should give you these." Oliver opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a photograph of him and Emily, taken during their last year in college. He didn't even remember it being taken. They were sitting on a bench, her head on his shoulder, both smiling, looking young and invincible. Next came a copy of Haley's birth certificate. His name was not listed as the father. But the timing matched exactly. Then he saw the letter, handwritten, with ink smudged in some places, as if it had been handled many times. It was from Emily. "Dear Oliver. If you're reading this, it means Haley found you. I hope that wherever life took you, you found peace and purpose. I never meant to keep her from you. I tried to reach out, but I couldn't find you. And after a while, I thought maybe it was for the best. You were building something great. I didn't want to be a burden or complicate your life. But now, I know that Haley needs you. She's strong, brave, smarter than I ever was. And I'm not going to be here to watch her grow up. I didn't plan for this. I didn't want this. But I trust that you'll do the right thing, not because you have to, but because somewhere deep down, you're still the man I loved. Emily." Oliver's hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter. A storm of feelings surged inside him, grief for Emily, guilt for not trying harder to stay in her life, and a growing, overwhelming sense of responsibility for the girl sitting across from him. Haley was watching him closely. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't speak at all. She just waited. He cleared his throat and said softly, "Would it be all right if we did a test? Just to be sure. A DNA test. Not because I don't believe you, but because I need it to be official." Haley nodded. "Mom said you would want that. She said it's okay." She wasn't offended. She wasn't hurt. She understood more than most adults would. Within the hour, Oliver had called his private physician to arrange for a discreet and expedited test. While they waited, he moved her into a guest suite at his home. He didn't want to send her to a hotel or keep her in the office. It felt wrong. She needed stability, and for now, that meant staying with him. That night, after he tucked her into the enormous bed in the guest room, a bed she looked comically small in, he stood in the doorway and watched her for a long time. She didn't ask for a bedtime story or a nightlight. She didn't ask where her toys were. She simply said, "Good night," and turned away. He went to his own room but couldn't sleep. His thoughts ran wild, images of Emily flashing in his mind, the sound of Haley's voice saying, "You're my dad," on loop in his memory. He stared out at the city lights for hours, wondering how everything had changed in a single morning, and how, somehow, it all felt more real than anything he'd built in his perfectly controlled life. The next morning, Oliver woke early, but he hadn't really slept. He had spent most of the night pacing his room, going over everything he had learned, everything Haley had said, and everything that had been left unsaid. He felt like a stranger in his own life. The towering ceilings, the pristine hardwood floors, the silence of his penthouse, all of it felt cold now, as if it belonged to someone else. He hadn't realized how hollow it all was until a child had walked in and filled it with something he hadn't known he was missing. He showered, dressed in a clean suit, and headed downstairs where he found the housekeeper, Maria, already preparing breakfast. She greeted him as usual but paused when she saw his expression. Before she could ask anything, he simply said, "There's a little girl upstairs. Her name is Haley. She'll be staying here for a while." He didn't explain. He wasn't ready to. He found Haley sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, her backpack already zipped. She looked up at him as he entered, then looked back down, as if unsure what she was allowed to do. The sight of her sitting so still, so quiet, tugged at something deep in him. "You don't have to be packed," he said softly. "You're not going anywhere." She looked up again, this time with a flicker of uncertainty. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "Yes. I'm sure." They ate breakfast together at the long dining table, a table that had never once been used for anything other than corporate dinners. Haley ate slowly, her manners impeccable, as if she didn't want to be any trouble. Oliver watched her more than he ate, trying to understand how a child so young could carry herself with such control. It was unnatural. And that realization made him ache in a way he couldn't quite name. By mid-morning, the doctor arrived. The DNA test was simple and quick, just a cheek swab. Haley didn't flinch. She sat calmly and cooperated without question. Oliver signed the paperwork and arranged for the results to be expedited. He was told it would take no more than 48 hours. The waiting would be unbearable, but he understood it was necessary. After the doctor left, he sat with Haley in the living room, unsure what to do next. "I need to ask you something else," he said gently. Haley nodded, waiting. "Why now? Why come find me now?" She hesitated, her eyes falling to her hands in her lap. "Because there was no one else." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain behind it. "My aunt said I had to go stay with people I didn't know. That it was too hard for her. She said it wasn't her job. So I waited until she left for work, then I packed my things and took the picture and the letter. I had the address. I just went." Oliver swallowed hard. A 5-year-old, navigating buses and city streets, completely alone, all to find someone who might not even want her. The fact that she had done it without fear, without hesitation, it terrified him. What kind of life had she been living? What had she been forced to accept as normal? "Did your mom ever talk about me? About the past?" Haley looked up, eyes bright but calm. "She said you were smart. That you were busy building something. She never said anything bad. She said if I ever needed you, you'd come through." Oliver looked away for a moment, trying to gather himself. Emily had protected his image, even when he hadn't deserved it. She hadn't told Haley about his silence. She hadn't filled her head with bitterness. She had just given her daughter hope. And now, Haley had placed all that hope in him. He spent the rest of the day trying to keep her busy. They went to a bookstore, and he let her choose whatever she wanted. She picked a collection of fairy tales, a beginner science book, and a small red journal. At lunch, they sat at a small cafe on a quiet street, and he noticed the way she scanned the room constantly, always watching the exits. She wasn't just cautious. She was prepared. Like someone who'd had to take care of herself. That night, he read to her from the fairy tale book she had chosen. His voice was awkward at first, stiff and unfamiliar in this new role, but she didn't seem to mind. She lay still under the blankets, watching him without interruption, her expression unreadable but open. When he finished, he closed the book and looked at her. "Is it okay if I stay until you fall asleep?" he asked. Haley nodded once, and after a pause, she said, "You don't have to try so hard." He blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" "You're already different from what I thought." "In a good way." He didn't know how to respond. All he could do was sit beside her, stunned by the weight of her words, and wait until her breathing slowed and sleep took her. When he left the room, he closed the door gently behind him and leaned against the wall in the hallway. For the first time in years, Oliver Hart wasn't thinking about his company, or his investors, or the next deal. He was thinking about a little girl who had come to find him, and how everything he thought he knew about himself had already begun to change. The DNA results arrived 2 days later, delivered in a plain envelope by a private courier. Oliver held it in his hands for several long minutes before opening it, standing in the silence of his office at home, his heart pounding like it hadn't in years. He had faced multi-million-dollar negotiations, lawsuits, and public scandals without blinking, but this small envelope carried a weight none of those things ever had. When he finally tore it open and read the document, there was no dramatic twist. The results were clear and undeniable. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Haley Reed was his biological daughter. He sat down slowly at his desk, staring at the paper, feeling something strange wash over him. It wasn't shock, he had already accepted it in his heart. It wasn't fear, though some part of him still worried he didn't know how to be a father. It was something more overwhelming than either, responsibility. Not the kind he was used to, where failure meant money lost or deals broken. This was the kind that meant everything, that reached into the deepest part of who he was and demanded he be someone better than he had been. He found Haley in the sunroom, sitting cross-legged on the floor, coloring in her new journal. She looked up as he entered, her face calm but quietly curious, as always. He knelt down beside her and held out the envelope. "It's official," he said. "You're mine." She stared at the envelope, then at him. "I already knew," she said. "But now you believe it too." There was no smugness in her tone, no triumph. Just a gentle certainty that somehow made him feel both humbled and proud. He didn't realize he had started to smile until she smiled back. From that moment on, everything changed. He hired a child therapist, not because he thought something was wrong with Haley, but because he wanted to understand how to support her. He started rearranging his schedule, canceling meetings, moving calls, delegating work that previously he never would have trusted to anyone else. His assistants were stunned. The board raised eyebrows. But Oliver didn't care. For the first time, something mattered more than the empire he had built. He enrolled Haley in a nearby private school with a small student-to-teacher ratio and a focus on emotional development. He personally met with the principal, walked the halls with Haley before her first day, and made sure she had a backpack she actually liked, not the one they had picked for her at the department store, but the one she found in a tiny shop downtown, decorated with galaxies and stars. He learned quickly that being a father didn't mean grand gestures. It meant remembering which night she liked spaghetti, and which night she preferred soup. It meant noticing when she was quiet for too long and learning to ask the right questions, not too direct, not too vague. It meant letting her keep the small routines she brought with her, like lining up her shoes before bed or hiding her favorite pencil under her pillow, because those routines had once made her feel safe. He also began to ask more questions about Emily. Over the weeks that followed, pieces of Emily's life began to unfold. Through conversations with Haley, and later with a woman named Kara, Emily's old friend who still lived in the city, he learned how hard she had worked to raise Haley alone. Emily had been a teacher, passionate and kind, but always struggling to make ends meet. When she got sick, she kept teaching as long as she could. She had hidden her illness from almost everyone, including her own sister, until it became impossible to hide. Haley had watched her mother deteriorate slowly and painfully. She remembered the hospital. She remembered the way Emily tried to smile, even when she couldn't sit up. And she remembered the day her aunt picked her up and told her she couldn't stay anymore. The full weight of that truth nearly broke Oliver. Not because it made him feel guilty, though it did, but because he hadn't been there. He hadn't even known. While he was closing deals and attending galas, the woman he once loved was dying, and the daughter he didn't know he had was learning how to survive without anyone. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Haley looked up from the dishes and asked, "Did you love her?" Oliver stopped, his hand frozen around a plate. He looked at her and saw not just curiosity, but a real need to know. "Yes," he said after a pause. "I did. I was young and stupid and too focused on the future. But yes, I loved her very much." Haley nodded and went back to washing without saying anything else. That small exchange, like many between them, felt like a stone placed carefully into a foundation they were building together, slowly, deliberately, with patience. By the end of the month, Haley had started smiling more. She laughed, really laughed, when she beat Oliver at board games or when Maria, the housekeeper, taught her how to make pancakes. She stopped sleeping with her shoes next to the bed. She no longer flinched when the doorbell rang. And one night, as Oliver walked past her room to check on her, he heard her humming. It was the same melody Emily used to sing when they were in college. That night, he sat alone in the dark living room, thinking about how far they had come in such a short time. He still didn't have all the answers. He still worried he would fail her. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never walk away again. It had been nearly 2 months since Haley first appeared in the lobby of Oliver's office building, and already his life looked and felt completely different. What once had been a precisely scheduled, business-driven existence had shifted into something warmer, more unpredictable, and, for the first time in years, meaningful. The sleek surfaces of his home now carried traces of a child's presence: picture books stacked on the coffee table, colored pencils left on the kitchen counter, and a red backpack hanging from the coat rack that used to hold nothing but his tailored overcoats. His life was no longer about quarterly reports and market forecasts. It was about learning who his daughter really was and how to become the kind of man she could rely on. One quiet afternoon, Oliver took Haley to visit the public library. It wasn't far, just a short drive through their neighborhood, but she lit up the moment he mentioned the idea. She loved books, loved reading them, flipping through them, even smelling them. That kind of enthusiasm was new to him. He had spent years reading only out of necessity, absorbing financial reports and legal briefs. But with her, reading became something different, something intimate. That day at the library, she pulled him toward the children's section and asked if they could sit together on the floor and read one of the picture books out loud. He did. He read to her with all the awkwardness of a man learning a new language, and she laughed when he gave the animal characters silly voices. He laughed too. And something in that laughter cracked open the last remaining part of him that had resisted change. That night, when Haley was already asleep, Oliver found himself scrolling through an old drive of personal files. Hidden among folders of contracts and speeches was a long-forgotten set of photos from his college days. Pictures of him and Emily. They were both so young in those images, full of hope, full of ideas, full of a future they never had time to finish. One photo in particular caught him off guard. It was a candid shot, Emily resting her head on his chest, his hand lightly brushing her shoulder, both of them smiling at something just outside the frame. He stared at it for a long time, overcome with the feeling that he was looking at the beginning of a story he hadn't realized he was still living. The next day, he made a decision. He called Kara, Emily's best friend, and asked if she would meet him for coffee. She agreed, a little surprised, but curious. They sat at a small cafe near her workplace, and Oliver, still not used to being vulnerable, spoke plainly. "I want to know more," he said. "About Emily." About those years I missed. Kara's expression softened. For the next hour, she told him stories. About how Emily had worked 2 jobs to support herself through school after he left. About how she'd never spoken ill of him, even when she was struggling. About how Haley had inherited her mother's resilience and her quiet stubbornness. Emily had never given up on life, even when her body began to. She had written letters she never sent, kept photos in a box under her bed, and once said that if she died before Haley met her father, she hoped the man he had become would be better than the one he used to be. The words hit Oliver with quiet force. He left the cafe that day with a clearer picture of the woman he had once loved and a deeper sense of the gift, and the responsibility, he now held. Back at home, he began making small but meaningful changes. He redecorated one of the guest bedrooms into a space just for Haley. He let her pick the colors, lavender and soft gray, and filled the shelves with books, science kits, and art supplies. He installed glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling after she told him, shyly, that her mom used to say stars help chase nightmares away. He cooked dinner more often, sometimes with her, sometimes for her, and though his culinary skills were limited, she always smiled and said it tasted better than takeout. She began to trust him in small, subtle ways, asking him to tie her shoes when the laces got knotted, holding his hand when they crossed the street, leaning on his shoulder during movie nights without a word. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when she got quiet and distant, when a sound or smell brought her back to a memory she didn't talk about. But he learned not to push. He learned to sit beside her in silence, to wait until she was ready, to make her feel safe by simply being consistent. Then, one evening, she came to him with a worn envelope in her hands. "This was the last letter Mom wrote," she said. "She said to give it to you when I felt like you were ready." His throat tightened as he took it. The letter was dated just weeks before Emily died. In it, she wrote about how much she had hoped they'd reconnect one day. She told him to be patient with Haley, to listen more than he spoke, to understand that love wasn't something that had to be perfect, it just had to be present. She told him she forgave him. That she still believed he had the heart to be the father Haley needed. Oliver read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and held it against his chest. He didn't cry, but he felt something deep inside settle, like the final piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. That night, he tucked Haley in as usual, but before turning off the light, he asked her quietly, "Do you think your mom would be proud of us?" Haley didn't even hesitate. "I think she'd be proud of you. And I think she'd be really happy I found you." He smiled, kissed her forehead, and turned off the light. As he stood in the hallway, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, he realized something profound. He hadn't just inherited a child. He had inherited the second chance he never thought he'd get. And this time, he wouldn't waste it. The seasons began to change, and with them, so did Oliver. He had once measured time in contracts, market trends, and quarterly profits, but now he found himself marking days by simpler, more human moments: Haley's first science project at school, her growing obsession with constellations, the way she began humming to herself while drawing, something she'd never done in the beginning. Every morning, she would come into the kitchen wearing mismatched socks and carrying a new fact she had memorized from a book, and he'd pretend he didn't already know it, just to hear her explain. She had become the center of his world without even trying, and it no longer scared him. It made him feel alive. Oliver's staff had noticed the change. His executive assistant stopped triple confirming his calendar because he no longer worked until midnight. He left board meetings earlier, declined unnecessary trips, and began pushing for more flexible schedules for employees with families. It hadn't gone unnoticed. At first, people whispered about him, wondered if he'd lost his edge, but then they saw something else. The company's culture had started to shift. Morale improved. People smiled more. There were fewer resignations, fewer burned-out managers. The transformation of one man's heart had quietly begun to reshape the empire he had built. But the biggest shift came when Haley brought home a note from school. Her class was holding a family day, a tradition where students invited their parents or guardians to visit the classroom, talk about their jobs, and share something personal. Haley handed him the invitation with an uncertain look, as if she wasn't sure he'd say yes. Oliver took the paper and studied it. He had given hundreds of speeches, faced reporters, analysts, and CEOs. But standing in a room full of children to talk about who he was, not as a businessman, but as Haley's dad, felt like the most intimidating thing he'd ever agreed to. When the day came, he wore a simple navy sweater instead of a suit. Haley beamed when she saw him walk into the classroom. The other children were buzzing with excitement, and their parents, some in uniforms, others in casual clothes, mingled around with relaxed smiles. Oliver felt completely out of place. But then Haley took his hand and guided him to her seat like it was the most natural thing in the world. When it was their turn, she stood beside him and introduced him to the class. "This is my dad," she said confidently. "He builds big buildings, but now he builds time for me too." There was a murmur of laughter, and a few parents smiled in quiet understanding. Oliver couldn't speak for a moment. Then he cleared his throat and began talking, not about stock markets or real estate portfolios, but about how important it is to listen to people, to give second chances, to never be too busy for the ones you love. He didn't mention the past, didn't tell the story of how they met. That was Haley's story to tell, if she ever wanted to. But he looked at her as he spoke, and she looked back at him like she already knew everything he was trying to say. Afterward, they walked out of the school into the golden light of afternoon. Haley skipped a little, her hand still in his. "You did good," she said. He smiled. "You did better." That weekend, he did something he hadn't done in decades. He took a trip with no agenda. Just the two of them, a rented cabin in the mountains, a telescope, and a sky full of stars. At night, wrapped in blankets on the porch, Haley pointed out constellations while he listened. She spoke with the joy of someone who had found her place in the universe. And for the first time in his life, Oliver felt like he had too. Back in the city, he began planning something more permanent. He reached out to his lawyers and drafted an official guardianship agreement. He wanted Haley to know, without any doubt, that he was hers and she was his, not by accident or biology, but by choice. When he showed her the paperwork and explained what it meant, she didn't cry or gasp. She just leaned into him and said, "I already knew." In the following days, he also began developing a new branch of his foundation, named in honor of both Emily and Haley. It would provide educational resources and emergency housing for single-parent families and children in crisis. He poured his heart into it, not as a legacy project, but as a way to turn everything he had learned into something lasting for others. His life, once full of noise, had found its rhythm. There were still meetings, deadlines, and expectations, but now, they were balanced by bedtime stories, school pickup lines, and weekend pancake mornings. And every now and then, when he passed a photo of Emily on the hallway shelf, a photo Haley had chosen and framed, he would pause, touch the edge of the frame, and whisper a silent thank you. For giving him a second chance. For giving him their daughter. For believing he could become the man he never thought he'd be. Spring came slowly that year, not in the weather itself. Los Angeles had little change in seasons, but in the feeling that settled over Oliver's life. It was in the quiet warmth of mornings that no longer began with email alerts, but with the sound of Haley's small footsteps padding into the kitchen, asking what kind of pancakes he planned to ruin today. It was in the way sunlight filtered through the curtains of her lavender bedroom, catching the drawings she had taped to the walls, stars, animals, buildings, a stick-figure version of him with "My Dad" written underneath in uneven letters. He had once measured success by the height of his buildings and the size of his numbers. Now he measured it in how many days he could make her laugh before breakfast. One Sunday morning, they sat together at the kitchen island, sharing a bowl of fruit and planning their day. Haley wanted to visit the planetarium again. She'd been obsessed with stars for months now, and Oliver promised they would. As she listed out everything she hoped to see, he found himself marveling at how much she'd changed in such a short time. There was still a quiet wisdom in her, a depth he knew had come from loss, but now there was also light. She giggled, she asked 100 questions a day, she rolled her eyes at his jokes, and she had started inviting friends over for weekend crafts and movie nights. Her world had expanded beyond survival, into curiosity and connection. Later that day, as they walked through the museum's grand dome and watched the simulated night sky spread above them, Oliver caught himself looking at her more than the stars. She pointed up, explaining constellations to a group of tourists like a tiny professor, completely unaware of the way people watched her, drawn to her presence. She had Emily's passion, his steadiness, and something entirely her own, an ability to make people feel like they belonged, just by being near her. In those moments, he often wondered if Emily could see them. If she knew that the girl she had raised with so much love and strength had changed everything about him. After they got home that night, Haley curled up beside him on the couch, her head on his shoulder, and they watched one of those old animated space movies she loved. She fell asleep halfway through, and he stayed there, holding her gently, not moving, not wanting the moment to end. As the credits rolled, he thought about how much had happened in the span of a single year. A child had walked into his office and told him she was his daughter. His past had cracked open like a fault line, and what had come out of it wasn't ruin, it was redemption. He remembered the early days, the silence between them, the way she slept fully clothed with her shoes by the bed, just in case. He remembered how she had watched people so carefully, always scanning for exits, always listening for danger. Now she fell asleep beside him with her face relaxed, her shoes forgotten, her dreams finally uninterrupted. Not long after, the court date came for the finalization of the adoption. Even though the DNA proved their bond and he was already her legal guardian, Oliver wanted the papers to reflect the truth he now lived daily, that she was his in every way that mattered. Haley insisted on wearing a white dress with little blue stars on it, and she clutched the same worn photo of Emily she always kept in her backpack. They sat in the courtroom together, surrounded by the quiet hum of legal formality, but for Oliver, it felt like a ceremony. A promise sealed in ink and law, but rooted in love. When the judge signed the final document, Oliver didn't cry. He just turned to Haley, took her hand, and said, "It's official now. You'll never have to wonder again." Haley smiled up at him, her blue eyes filled with the same calm certainty she had shown that very first day. "I never wondered. But I'm glad it's written down." That evening, they celebrated with cake and a few close friends at home. The dining room, once a place for polished dinner parties and business strategy, was now cluttered with balloons, hand-drawn cards, and loud laughter. Maria, the housekeeper who had become like a grandmother, wept openly while holding Haley's shoulders, and Oliver, standing in the middle of it all, felt something he never expected, complete. Not powerful, not proud. Just whole. He walked into his office later that night, the only quiet room in the house, and picked up the letter Emily had written him, now kept in a glass frame on his desk. He read it again, as he often did when he needed her voice to steady him. She had asked him to show up for Haley not out of guilt or obligation, but out of love. And he had. Not perfectly, not instantly, but fully. He whispered a thank you into the silence and turned off the light. Months passed, and the rhythm of life continued. School, birthdays, slow Sunday mornings, late-night science talks, beach trips, and bedtime stories. Oliver no longer checked his phone during dinner. He no longer counted his success in assets or influence. He counted it in memories. He counted it in the number of times Haley fell asleep mid-sentence, trusting he'd be there when she woke up. And he always was. One summer evening, as they lay on a blanket in their backyard, staring at the sky through a telescope, Haley turned to him and asked, "Do you think Mom would have liked all this?" Oliver looked at her, then back up at the stars. "I think she would have loved it," he said. "Especially you." Haley smiled and rolled onto her side, curling into him the way she always did when she was ready to fall asleep. And as the night air cooled around them, Oliver felt something settle in his chest: peace. The quiet kind that only comes when you know you've finally become the person you were always meant to be. This story is a testament to the idea that sometimes the most unexpected disruptions in life are not accidents, they're invitations to become who we were always meant to be. What began as a tale of wealth, loneliness, and control evolved into something far more human, a journey toward redemption, connection, and unconditional love. The most powerful transformation wasn't external. It wasn't in the company, the house, or the court papers. It was inside Oliver himself. He didn't just become a father, he became present, vulnerable, and real. The ending doesn't rely on a dramatic twist or a grand gesture. Its strength lies in its quiet honesty, the image of a once distant man lying under the stars with his daughter, answering her question not with performance, but with truth. That kind of peace, the kind that's earned through pain, growth, and deep listening, is rare. And it stays with you. This isn't just a happy ending, it's a meaningful one. Because it reminds us that healing doesn't erase the past, but it gives it purpose. And that love, when chosen every day, can rewrite even the most broken story.